Chinese President Xi Jinping calls for solidarity during his Southeast Asia tour. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. On a three-nation swing through Southeast Asia, Chinese President Xi Jinping's message was clear. In a world grappling with growing uncertainty and instability fueled by rising protectionism and unilateralism, China reaffirms the continuity and stability of its neighborhood diplomacy and its vision for lasting peace and shared development in Asia. In Cambodia, President Xi urged Phnom Penh to resist protectionism. Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Manet recently described Beijing as an important and indispensable friend of Cambodia that has helped support the country's economic and social development. CGTN's Silkina Aluwalia has more in this report.
President Xi had a really productive day since his arrival, meeting the Prime Minister and the King. Trade is definitely at the top of the meetings. As we know, this visit is happening during a very intense global trade issue. So this visit is a really important one for both nations, especially in terms of investments and people-to-people relations. We can see that from highways and airports to trade and energy. Chinese investments have reshaped Cambodia's infrastructure over the last 20 years, and it's expected to grow even stronger. President Xi himself mentioned that it's so important now more than ever for countries to come together, to stay united, to have a more open relationship with one another. And I can say, being on the ground, the excitement here is so evident. This is President Xi's first visit to Cambodia since 2016, and people are celebrating, cheering, and genuinely excited to have China's support here. We can really see that the focus of this visit is not just politics, but something more personal, the bond between the people of China and Cambodia. But at the same time, Belt and Road projects like highways have created thousands of jobs, opened up new education opportunities, and given families access to better roads. So you can see that the story of China and Cambodia is increasingly a story of people standing together, building together, and growing together. President Xi called this friendship ironclad, which means that no matter how hard things get, both nations will always respect and support each other. President Xi also talks a lot about a shared future, and being here in Cambodia, you can see what that community actually looks like. Silkina Aluwalia, CGTN, Phnom Penh.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Einar Tangen is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and founder of Asia Narratives on Substack. Yun Sun is a senior fellow and director with the Stimson Center, where she focuses on East Asia and China. Also with us is Elina Noor. She's a senior fellow in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And Nguyen Hong Hai is a senior lecturer at VinUniversity in Hanoi. He's currently a visiting scholar at American University School of International Service right here in Washington, D.C. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Nguyen Hong Hai, let's start right here in the studio. So China is Vietnam's largest trading partner. In fact, looking at the figures here, bilateral trade surpassed $200 billion in each of the last 4 years. So how would you characterize President Xi's visit and the importance of this bilateral relationship?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to look at the context of the visits of President Xi to Vietnam. The context here, I mean, the situation in China, the situation in Vietnam, and also more broadly, Trump's tariff and also Trump administration's policies to Southeast Asia and also to the Indo-Pacific. So I think all of those issues is very important. That make the visits by Chinese President Xi Jinping to Vietnam is very significant. And of course, now in Vietnam, Vietnam just had a new leadership, and also Vietnam is preparing for the 14th Party Congress in 2026. So that means that the current leaderships might change. So I think the visit by President Xi Jinping is also significant in the sense that he set the foundation for even the transitions of the leaderships in Vietnam. And also, I think his visit to Vietnam is that he's trying to strengthen the bonds between the two countries. The bonds here is not only at the state level, but also the party-to-party level.
Right.
And also the people-to-people level. Overall, I think Xi's visits to Vietnam is very significant for both countries, for both parties,
right.
and also for both people.
Yeah, in terms of the economic and trade relationship, it already is a very close relationship, isn't it?
Yes, very close relationship. I think Vietnam is quite heavily reliant on the supplies of production materials for Vietnam. And that's why the trade surplus between Vietnam and China is very high. And of course, Vietnam is also suffering from that kind of trade deficits.
Right.
Yeah.
Einar Tangen, in an article in the Cambodian media, President Xi urged Phnom Penh not to engage in hegemonism and protectionism. He made similar calls in Vietnam and Malaysia as well, countries he is visiting during this tour. What do you make of the timing of this visit, coming at a time, as we've just heard, when there is growing uncertainty and instability in the world?
Well, I think it's a mistake to think that this was all ginned up just on a pretext of answering Donald Trump's challenge to Asia and the world. Remember the 75th anniversary of Vietnam and U.S. Relations. This was a long time in the planning. It just happens that this is another showcase of how China is continuing to spread economic development through its neighborhoods, through the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's very important. There were a lot of similar themes when he went to all three countries that are being echoed now in Cambodia, the shared future, the importance of building community with good relations, deepening political trust, people-to-people exchanges, multilateralism, and most importantly, what you said is resisting those who are trying to tear the world apart as opposed to help it grow.
Elina Noor, a paper published last year called China Through a Southeast Asian Lens, which you co-wrote, said in part, and I'm quoting here, many Southeast Asians view China as a significant economic partner given its market size and expectations of forthcoming investment, unquote. Of course, China is also deeply involved in many of these countries in the region, in infrastructure development, especially through the BRI. So tell us more about that involvement.
I think it's certainly true that China is the largest trading partner for many Southeast Asian countries. It's been Malaysia's largest trading partner for 16 consecutive years, for example. But there is a lot of texture to that relationship. There are some pieces of that relationship puzzle that need to be worked out moving forward, particularly on the political security front with some Southeast Asian countries. But it's undeniable that China is an important and significant partner in the economic growth of many, if not all, of the Southeast Asian countries. On his tour in Southeast Asia this week, as Einar mentioned, a lot of the same themes running through the three countries that he's visiting or has visited, including things like the high growth, high value sort of focus on infrastructure and economic developments that many countries in Southeast Asia, governments and people alike, really want to see happening in their countries. And so the picture is largely positive on the economic front with many of these Southeast Asian ties with China.
Nguyen Sun, good to see you. It has been some time, but President Xi, during this visit, also made the case very strongly for free trade as he toured these countries. And as Einar pointed out, this trip was planned some time ago, but if we look at the optics of it, how important is it, the message that he carried and how it's being received in the region?
Well, given that Donald Trump just launched or relaunched the trade war against the whole world, and especially China, I think the message from Beijing is quite clear that free trade is the way to go, and protectionism and unilateralism, when these words are being used, the thinly veiled condemnation is certainly finger pointed at Washington and the protectionist and unilateralist moves that Washington has taken. And if you look at the trade figures, Southeast Asia, ASEAN more specifically, is indeed China's largest trading partner, if you look at the trade data from last year, followed by European Union and followed by the United States. So when we talk about the trade relationship, people don't quite realize that not only China is important for Southeast Asia, but vice versa. Southeast Asia is that important for China. Our Vietnamese colleague just mentioned the trade deficit that Vietnam runs with China. And this situation is not unique to Vietnam. In fact, among all Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia is the only country that runs a trade surplus against China. What this means is essentially that China is exporting its materials, parts, its products, sometimes is for transshipment through Southeast Asian countries, sometimes is for processing trade, the value added to be created in Southeast Asian countries. So this is what the Chinese would call the capacity building in the trade facilitation or trade creation field for Southeast Asian nations, which is wildly popular for Southeast Asia. But the other side of the equation is that where are Southeast Asian countries exporting these products to, right? Which is why that when you look at U.S. trade relations with Vietnam, for example, Vietnam runs a trade surplus of $126 billion with the United States last year. So inevitably, I think this is going to create some difficulty for Southeast Asia moving forward, because if they continue this relationship with China, inevitably they will be seen as a backdoor for China to export to the United States, and that will lead to retaliation and severe retaliation in some cases from Washington.
What is your view on that, Nguyen?
Well, I think absolutely, I agree that it could be very tough for Vietnam, in fact, in dealing with the Trump administration at the moment, particularly when the Trump administration find that the transshipment from the U.S. And that would be end up in the U.S. So I think that would be a very challenge for Vietnam.
Yeah. And Einar, you mentioned Cambodia. While there, President Xi also met the king as well as the Cambodian premier and other leaders in the country. I mean, as you point out, China has played a pivotal role in the socio-economic development of Cambodia. How do you see it evolving?
Well, it's going to continue economically, and that was the whole point. You saw him executing all of these deals that were a continuation. This is not China showing up at the door because of Donald Trump. This has been steady 10-year friendships, cooperations, development, helping them countries with their security. But this has not been about dominating these countries. Yes, there are frictions, and they're going to have to be settled, especially over the South China Sea. But these frictions are normal. They can be talked about. And, in the Asian way, it has to come through consensus. But I think it's really, really important that these countries realize that they have to stand up for themselves. ASEAN has been powerful because it is 10 nations that has been able to deal with other nations that are much larger. Otherwise, they get divided. This is the real message that has to be struck home to all of these countries.
Elina, ASEAN indeed is a powerful bloc, 10 member states. President Xi reportedly discussed a free trade agreement with ASEAN. Malaysia, of course, chairs the group right now. And in a recent interview with the Malaysian Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry, on what role ASEAN could play countering this shift away that we're seeing from multilateralism and the threat to the liberal trade order, this is what the minister had to say. Let's listen.
We need to act as one in our approach, right? That's why the concept of ASEAN centrality is key. I think ASEAN has a middle power role to play, right? Where we can try and navigate these very tricky and uncertain times by being together. And then that's why ASEAN centrality is important. And what we need to do is continue to be non-aligned, continue to be neutral, and at the same time, always put our interests first.
So, Elina, we see a bloc like the European Union acting in concert, acting as a bloc to counter what President Trump is doing. Can ASEAN emulate that, act as a bloc rather than individual countries trying to negotiate their own bilateral deals with the United States?
Yeah, I'd be very careful about comparing ASEAN to the EU, but certainly I think look at the historical development of ASEAN. There's always been consensus in thought and largely in action as well on the economic front. And ASEAN has performed actually very well, contrary to criticisms from the outside, on that particular front, on the economic front, and on trying to make people's lives more practicably functional and on the uptrend for many years now. So for example, over 90% of businesses in Southeast Asia are actually micro, small, and medium enterprises. And if you look at some of the steps that have been taken within the ASEAN economic community, you'll see that things like cross-border local transactions have now been in place. QR codes to facilitate these local transactions are also in place, trying to make people's lives easier on the ground. And I think there's a very keen realization amongst those in power in ASEAN, especially on the economic and finance front, that there has to be unity and centrality that the Malaysian minister was talking about. And this realization has only become starker now with the tariffs that President Trump has imposed on all the world.
Nguyen, where do you see the greatest potential for increased trade between Vietnam and China? I mean, China, of course, is involved in a whole range of sectors. But when we look at things like China's technology development, I mean, how do you see that relationship develop with Vietnam, especially, the shift to green technology?
Yeah, I'm surprised when I recently read a report on Vietnamese population attitudes to China's developments. And more than 80% of Vietnamese people views China's technology's development is great. And it's a great opportunity for Vietnam to make use of China's technology's development, particularly also during the visits by Xi Jinping to Vietnam. Both sides also emphasize on the collaborations in green energy, blue economy, and digital economy. So I think, yeah, Vietnam also look, to China's in terms of collaboration developments in the technologies areas, particularly when Vietnam is emphasizing on technology as one of the breakthrough new labor force for the countries to development in the new era that the Vietnamese leader have emphasized, and that's also the key industrial tool for Vietnam to overcome the middle income trap.
Einar Tangen, as China focuses on the domestic consumer market, I mean, would it reduce its export market in any significant way? I mean, think of things like, the export market for things like green technology and green products.
Well, I don't know why they'd restrict that. Quite frankly, these are things that are in demand. If these countries are going to be independent, and especially in terms of energy, they need to switch over to the green development. But there should also be, under the Asian way, this idea of friendship. Who has helped you in the past? Where has ASEAN come? As together with China, the U.S. has not been a good partner. It has been buying, but it buys things simply because it cannot produce them. And I think it's time that people realize that the U.S. is going to change. Donald Trump engaged in a bluff that he cannot carry through. And, on a daily basis, you hear him just screaming that China has to call me, It's nonsense. And I hope these nations can see past their, quote, interests to understand that their long-term interests lie in ASEAN staying together, staying strong, and not being picked off individually.
Nguyen Hong Hai, can Southeast Asia, ASEAN in particular, become a significant counterweight to the kind of policies that we're seeing being practiced by the Trump administration right now? You know, in one of our earlier shows on this particular subject, one of the analysts said that multilateralism and open free trade will survive. It will continue. The one big difference will be is that the United States will not be at the center of it anymore.
Well, we are seeing that with our own eyes. Well, it's expanding in front of us, right? When U.S. decided to eliminate USAID and eliminate the institutions such as USIP, both of which have had a significant presence in Southeast Asia, I think it leaves the impression that U.S. no longer cares. U.S. may still care about the trade deficit and may still care about tariffs and how to retaliate against the region, but that's not the positive messaging. Whether Southeast Asia or ASEAN as a whole can play a role of counterbalancing the U.S. behavior, I'm personally not too optimistic about it, but I do agree that multilateralism is going to survive. In fact, if you look at the U.S. action or the U.S. reaction, it is to the I would say the reality of the fact that the U.S. is no longer as strong a unilateral hegemon as it used to be. So what we're seeing out of Washington is, in fact, a policy response to the relative decline of the United States in the international system. So I would like to emphasize that in the long run, when we look at the longer-term trend in the international system, in the global governance arena, we are still seeing multilateralism, and multilateralization is a main theme here.
Elina, what is your view on what seems like, you know, a growing and changing geopolitical dynamic in that part of the world? And we see China's growing influence as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with my friend Nguyen Hong Hai. There is still multilateralism. We're just seeing it in very different forms. So, for example, Malaysia, as ASEAN chair, has decided to continue what was started earlier of having the ASEAN and GCC countries meet, for example, at the summit level. This year, Malaysia is going to invite China to a trilateral meeting between ASEAN, the GCC, and now China. At the same time, ASEAN is still, under Malaysian chairmanship, trying to fix its relationship, improve its relationship with the United States through an ASEAN-US summit. And I think that there is, again, this cognizance that the world is going to be very different because the world is already very different. Granted that, you know, the US has on occasion tried to play a role in multilateralism, but the multilateralism that we are seeing today is going to look very different from now on, and ASEAN in particular will want to play more of a role in shaping that form of the multilateralism and the frameworks that underpin it. Because for a long time, Southeast Asian countries have been complaining, particularly at the UN level, that the structure that we have had since World War II no longer works for the global majority.
Nguyen Hong Hai, you know, one of the things we've seen emphasized by China, and we've seen it particularly from President Xi, is cultural ties. You know, he's been very vocal about the need for people-to-people exchanges in that part of the world. What is your experience of that? What do you see?
Well, I think that China's call on cultural diplomacy is a part of course, a broader foreign policy launched by Xi Jinping from 2013, which is neighborhood diplomacy. And of course, cultural diplomacy is a part of that, you know, that foreign policy. And I think the most important of that kind of cultural diplomacy is that, particularly in the case of Vietnam, is China trying to work with Vietnam in order to strengthen and build a solid social foundation, which is very important. And of course, between the two countries, they already have cultural bodies for thousands of years already. But because of the up and down in the histories of the two countries' relationship, so cultural diplomacy is now more important in order to raise importance of the awareness of the society, of the people, right. And also trying to have a more a positive view to China's. And I can see this is a opposite wave of China's with the Trump administration at the moment. I see cultural diplomacy now is a part of what I call the charming diplomacy. And on the other side is more, you can say, more unilateral diplomacy or aggressive diplomacy. So I think and of course, when China is focusing more on the neighboring countries, I think cultural diplomacy is more important.
Einar, what's your view on that? I mean, how big a market is Southeast Asia for Chinese tourists? And Chinese tourists play a big, huge role in international tourism right now.
Yeah, I mean, Chinese tourists are among the highest spending. It's the largest number, growing middle class. The numbers are going to continue to increase. But, it's also part of this go to your neighborhood issue that China has been promoting. No longer are as many people going to Europe and the United States and spending money. They would prefer to go to areas, especially in Southeast Asia, where they share culture, where it's much more accessible, it's a lot less expensive, and this helps everybody.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.